Hi, welcome to the first and maybe only Electorama News Weekly Edition. I'm Rob Lanphier, founder of the Election Methods mailing list and co-founder of electedwiki.org, among other things. And I'm joined by this week's co-host, Tom Cavin. Tom and I met recently on one of the Electorama calls, which have been held on the third Wednesday of each month since December. Today we're previewing the featured story from the Electorama News monthly newsletter, which for April is the Maine Supreme Judicial Court's ranked choice voting advisory opinion. Before we get to the Maine Supreme Court Judicial Court's decision, Tom, could you introduce yourself and maybe a pointer to your work in electoral reform?
Hi all, I'm Tom Cavin, and I'm an amateur mathematician, hacker, system dynamicist, and voting theorist. And I've just spent a few years devoted to designing and testing a vote-moderated collective negotiation system called Serial Approval Vote Election. I'm no longer sure about the acronym, given its collision with some other current uses, but the method itself goes beyond other voting systems by using multiple rounds and using these rounds to converge on the best collective choices and get new and better proposals. The website is still a work in progress and is https://serialapprovalvoteelection.org.
The main story today is that Maine Supreme Judicial Court issued an advisory opinion stating that the current bill to expand ranked choice voting to Maine general elections for governor and the state legislature would conflict with the Maine Constitution. We plan to read key excerpts from electedwiki.org/wiki/Maine, the Maine ElectoWiki article, during this episode, starting with Tom providing some background information on Maine's use of RCV/IRV. Take it away, Tom.
Okay. Maine was the first state to adopt ranked choice voting, RCV, for statewide and federal elections, following a citizen initiative in 2016, and the first to use RCV in a presidential general election in 2020. The system has faced legal challenges over its compatibility with the state constitution's plurality requirement, and as of April 2026, is used for federal contests and state primaries, but not for general elections for governor or the state legislature. In May 2017, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court issued an advisory opinion concluding that RCV for state-level general elections conflicted with the Maine Constitution's requirement that winners be elected by a plurality of votes. The court interpreted plurality as the most votes in a single round of counting, which it found incompatible with RCV's multi-round elimination process. The Maine legislature subsequently passed a bill to delay and potentially repeal RCV if a constitutional amendment was not passed by 2021. Reform advocates responded by gathering signatures for a people's veto, which voters approved of 54% to 46%. This vote restored RCV for federal races and all primary elections, while leaving state-level general elections under the plurality system.
So the court ruled in 2017 that RCV is not plurality, and that plurality is how things are decided. So many folks argue that Condorcet methods are majoritarian and so are clearly also pluralitarian. Approval advocates will argue that approval is a plurality method too, and even Starr may be safe from scrutiny, since it's my understanding at least that the ruling speaks a bit to RCV's lack of precinct summability, which is uniquely problematic for RCV. Regardless of what the Maine SJC did, Maine voters were able to get RCV reinstituted for federal elections, even start voting for President of the United States using RCV. We pick up the plot in 2025. Take it away, Tom.
In 2025, State Senator Cameron Rennie introduced LD 1666, a bill to extend RCV to gubernatorial and state legislative general elections. The bill passed both chambers on June 18, 2025, and was sent to Governor Janet Mills. On June 25, 2025, the legislature recalled LD 1666 from the governor's desk and carried it over to the next session after supporters learned Mills was likely to veto it. As a carried over bill rather than a new introduction, LD 1666 returned to the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee in January 2026, received another work session on January 30th, and was reported out again on February 9th. On February 10th, 2026, the House and Senate again advanced the bill while also moving to seek a new advisory opinion from the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. The same day, the legislature unanimously passed a joint order, SB 900, invoking a constitutional provision known as a solemn occasion to request a new advisory opinion from the Maine SJC on whether LD 1666 is compatible with the Constitution's plurality requirements. On April 6th, 2026, the justices unanimously advised that LD 1666 would violate the Maine Constitution if enacted, concluding that the state's Constitution treats a vote for a governor or the legislature as a single choice counted and declared by municipalities, not as a ranking to be retabulated in later rounds.
Seems to me there's two big issues here. There's the plurality issue, which the word plurality is plastered all throughout a lot of the prose in the Maine Constitution. And then there's the precinct summability issue, which it sounds like the Maine Supreme Judicial Court is also considering a problem with ranked choice voting. Tom, any thoughts on either of those?
Well, I'll take the one about the summability, because that I think it's a serious issue from a social standpoint, not just a vote counting standpoint. Because when you're doing an election, you want to have trust in the results, and usually you might trust your own local officials more than you trust those folks in the government back in the center or something. And you can't sum an RCV election because of the way it's counted. You can't. The basic problem with it is that if you don't have a majority winner, or even if you do have a majority winner in your district, it's not necessarily going to be the same majority winner in other districts. So you don't even know how to count your votes. That means you basically have to collect your ballot, have everybody cast the votes, collect the ballots, then ship them off to the central counting facility, and you have no idea what's going on. And it's also not clear that if you're looking at like precinct by precinct results, you don't have those because they can't be done. It's impossible to know how any given district or area voted, which leaves a lot of folks confused.
Well, I think in fairness to RCV, I think the tradition is that each precinct reports its first place votes. That's the first place votes are not actually then all added up. Like that's not used for the vote total. The vote total is only done centrally, but just because, but it is possible to report precinct first place votes on election night. And I think in Maine they do that. I don't know that for sure though.
Yeah, but still, when you don't, when you're looking at the counts, you have one count, but you don't know what will be second. You don't know what the lowest one is. Basically, you're trusting a bunch of people who are outside your district, and it's depending on how you trust your government, you could do that. You could also do a lot of combinatorial magic or effort to run all the possible ways you could count those ballots and submit that or record that before your ballots leave, and then you could check. But that means copying all the ballots and shipping one pair off, or it's messier than other elections. Precinct sum will be a nice thing, and not having that is a big downside of this system.
Yeah, it is a messy story all around. So we learned about the story in Maine from Sarah Walk's post on the Voting Theory Forum in a post titled "RCV Found Unconstitutional in Maine." That title is arguably broader than the advisory opinion, but it still does raise the question about whether someone could sue to overturn RCV for federal races in Maine. There's a lot of discussion over on votingtheory.org about whether this ruling may affect approval voting, star voting, Condorcet voting, and others. And that's a huge can of worms. We're not going to get into that today. We just don't have time for it. But the article that we read from is at electowiki.org/wiki/Maine, and everyone listening or watching is free to revise it, which we may be doing after this conversation. On to other Reddit, in the EndFPTP subreddit, one of the visible April posts was about a proportional representation resolution failing at the Liberal Party of Canada's convention. And a different high visibility post asked about Hungary's TISA party and clearly said it would, and if wondering if they've actually committed to any sort of electoral reform, which as near as we could tell, no. But yeah, Tom, do you have any comments on either of those?
Well, basically it's information, but Canada, what the Liberal Party is doing in Canada doesn't affect me. But it's, and for TISA, I have hopes that what they're going to be doing is good, but I don't know what it is yet. I think there are a lot of things to do in addition to or above election reform in Hungary. And from the sound of it, they can do just about anything. And also from the sound of other things I've heard, they're going to try and do a whole lot of things to get the country back to where they want. So I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. I mean, I think the Liberal Party of Canada thing is interesting to me just because, being so close to the United States, and also it was the Liberal Party of Canada, which my understanding of things is the Liberal Party is actually like more conservative than maybe Americans might like. That's kind of the more conservative wing of Canadian politics, from what I understand. But regardless, yeah, they held a resolution and they decided not to move to RCV there. So even for intra-party politics, which is you would think it would be a little bit easier to pull that off. But anyway, other stuff in the electoral reform space, over on the Voting Theory forum, in addition to that main thread, there was also the Smith primary to approval discussion, as well as a thread called Consensus Choice, which presented the newer Condorcet style method. I'm assuming the Voting Theory forum was basically some of the better choices for democracy folks talking about their Condorcet variant that they are now promoting in that organization, with that organization. Tom, do you know much more about any of that stuff?
Not really. It's a Smith primary. It seems like you're trying to define the Smith set and then use approval on it to figure out what's going on. So the method of finding the Smith set is going to get you a Condorcet winner if there is one, but then you have to do approval voting on what's there. Might be an interesting idea, but I haven't seen any simulations or done anything playing with it. And Consensus Choice. Well, I'd have to read it, and I haven't, so I apologize for that one. But that could be interesting. We'll have to see if it gets further than that thread.
Yeah. The election methods mailing list. The busiest thread has been about the majority beat versus plurality beat Condorcet. And then there was another active thread about filling a vacated seat using STV. When we were preparing for this discussion, Tom and I discussed like what is that even, the majority beat versus plurality beat? What does that even mean? At this point, we're not sure. We haven't read the thread, so y'all are going to have to do that. Any further thoughts, Tom?
No, it looks like if anything is going to be, if there's a majority candidate there, you're pretty much going to have to be a plurality candidate. A majority winner is also going to be a plurality winner. I think under most systems, it doesn't make any sense otherwise. But approval is the only one where you can get multiple majority winners, as far as I can tell. And then, you may have more majority winners, but you're going to have more, you will still only have, you probably have even a smaller number of plurality winners in that case. So could be interesting, but again, we don't know.
Yeah. So there's a lot of discussion out there. You're all, it's all public information that we're talking about. Tom, was there any other stuff that you wanted to talk about before we close off this little segment?
That thing about filling a seat from STV, it again, I'm totally ignorant of what they're saying, but from the sentence there, you've got a seat, you essentially add an election, have, I don't know if it's single winner or multiple or multi-winner. If it's single winner, you have an election and somebody's gone from the election, they die before they, or somehow are disqualified before they take office or after. And it seems like you're trying to use the same votes to pick somebody else. Interesting idea. I'm not sure it's so great. It's even more complicated when you look at STV and multi seats. Well, from my point of view, I'd rather have the elections be quick and easy enough that you can redo them, rather than trying to rehash old ballots and come up with somebody else. So, interesting puzzle. Hopefully not something we're going to have to deal with anytime soon. So that's my gut feeling out of ignorance, which
okay
is how it.
All right. Well, anyway, that is it for Electorama News Weekly for this week. This format will probably be changing. We'll generally have a featured story, but for some weeks we may have a featured guest instead. Some weeks we may have other co-hosts. Some weeks we may have today's co-host Tom as the invited guest. Some weeks we may have a short tour through the monthly newsletter draft, and some weeks we may even be more like office hours or whatever the election methods world is arguing about. So the plan is to use activity on ElectoWiki, Reddit, mailing lists, forums, organization updates as source material for this conversation that's easier to follow than a raw feed. The main article you use today is at electowiki.org/wiki/Maine. The working monthly notes are at electowiki.org/wiki/Electorama News/2026-April. If you have any corrections or want to make any other election or want to note any other election reform news, we should send your suggestions to news@electorama.com or note them on the talk page for the newsletter, or just edit the newsletter directly. And just do it before April 30th, since I'm planning to publish it around that time. And I'm Rob Lanphier.
And I'm Tom Cavin.
And thanks for watching the Electorama News Weekly.
And good night.